Hi, welcome to the studio. My name is Paul Balkan, and tomorrow is July 20th, 50 years after humanity stepped on the moon. Quite an extraordinary feat. And I thought I'd do something special. I'd make a little mini lumen, which is this 3D kind of laser cut birch ply decoration. You can collect them. I make a new one. I make a few new every month, and this has got a red oak base, and it's a shot of basically the moonscape. You have the lunar module. You have Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong. You have the flag. You have some of the scientific instruments that's on the moon, and little planet Earth on the top back there. So, if you're looking for a nice little memento, it's in script. There's an inscription on it that says Apollo 11, July 20th, 1969. And it says 50th anniversary, July 20th, 2019. So, and there's the old retro NASA logo. So if you're looking for something unique and different as a gift or just for yourself, give this a try. This is available on my Etsy website, Etsy page. So just go to etsy.com. That's etsy.com, and type in Mini Lumen, all one word, MINILUM, M as in Mary, N as in Nancy, and you'll find all of my little mini lumens. There's landscapes. There's some local stuff too from Winnipeg, but and by the way, if you're in Winnipeg, you could order this and I'll deliver it to you. So no shipping charges there. I don't make any money off the shipping charges. They're a bit expensive, but there's not much I can do. But yeah, if you want to celebrate with something totally unique, laser cut mini moonscape to celebrate the 50th anniversary, which is tomorrow. Now, I've had a lifelong passion with the space program. Since I was a kid in elementary school, grade 4, I just learned about the astronauts. This was in the mid-70s, and I just fell in love with the idea of going to space. And the one book, I went to a small school, a rural school in Labroquerie, Manitoba, and we had a very, very small library. It was, there wasn't much there. But we had a few books, and one was Americans in Space. And this is the book that made me dream about being an astronaut. And it was simply about the Mercury 7 astronauts. Now, the book actually was written during the missions, and I think they didn't do all of the missions. I think Scott Carpenter hadn't gone up yet, I believe. Was it Carpenter? Or Cooper? Might have been Cooper. But they had not all been up there. But anyway, they actually talked about the beginning of humanity's yearning to go into space. So they talk about the early testing done. They talk about Jules Verne and his sci-fi novel Journey to the Moon. You have the aeronauts making balloons in the 1700s in France. You have the Chinese with developing fireworks, and also the Russian named Tsiolkovsky, who did a lot of theories and calculations, and one of the first to say that, yeah, we can make a vessel to go to the moon, a big one. And of course, there's lots here on Goddard, Robert Goddard, who invented the liquid-fueled rocket. So this was a fantastic little book for a little guy like me. And I thought, wow, I want to be an astronaut. So that was my dream. I read everything I could about being an astronaut, astronomy and science, and the limited books we had there. But by the time I got to grade 7, I was just before junior high, I realized my math skills were not very good, and I'd never be an astronaut. So unfortunately, I became an industrial designer, or graphic designer, but I've always kept the interest and the passion for astronomy and space. So if you're looking for a book for your kid to get into this, you might find it at a used bookstore. It's a nice book. Here's one book that I think is really, really worth reading. This is a book that really gave me an idea of how difficult it was and how extraordinary, these engineers that created the Saturn V, the whole Apollo program, the whole works, the behind-the-scenes story. And this is called Apollo, and it's written by Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox. Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox. It's called Apollo, and this is one of the best books I've ever read about NASA's moon missions. It's all behind the scenes, and it's done in a language that's very understandable. It's not highly technical and dry. I find a lot of books tend to be a little bit too technical and dry, and after a while your eyes kind of glaze over. But this is actually really well written. It's captivating. It really keeps you interested, even pictures. And they really did their research very well. They explain, for example, the F1 engines, the first stage engines on the Saturn V. They had a tough time making them because they used to explode all the time because they had they developed this turbulence inside the mixing chamber. I believe it's that, and it created vibrations and would shake the whole engine apart during tests. And they had to find a solution for that, and they tried everything. And at the end, they just said, well, we've tried everything. Let's just put holes in a mixing plate. It's huge. I think it was, a 1-inch thick steel plate, and just drill holes any willy-nilly. Because they had tried everything and nothing worked. And it worked. So it just goes to show you that a lot of the engineering, a lot of the solutions were done sometimes by trying any crazy idea and just writing it down on the side of a blueprint, and hopefully they would remember it. And that's why you can't build a Saturn V anymore from the plans, because there's so much information from these guys, these incredible engineers that got put to the side. But anyway, there's lots of really, really interesting, behind the scenes stuff. Like, for example, okay, well, you figure out how much of a rocket you're going to need to put so much weight, a capsule, a lunar module, and astronauts to the moon. Well, you got to build a rocket that's over 300 feet tall. So, okay, we got to build a huge building for it. Oh, okay. We have to build it so far away from a launch pad to, in case it explodes, to protect the launch center. And how do you bring it there? They thought of putting canals and barges and putting the rocket on a barge and towing it to the launch pad, stuff like that. They were trying all kinds of crazy ideas, hoping something would work. And so this is fascinating. I found this one of the best books about NASA that I'd ever read. So Apollo by Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox. Oh, by the way, I think it's out of print. So you might have to look into used bookstores for this one. It's hard to find, a little pricey, but really worth your investment. And I thought I'd talk about other things too, about the books that I found that were really moved me and kept my interest going. One is called Arrows to the Moon, and this is more of Canadian content, but it explains how Canadians have contributed a lot to the American space program in the 60s and 70s. And two people who I think are being talked about a lot now here in Canada is Jim Chamberlain and Owen Maynard. And Owen Maynard came up with the design for the lunar module. He was instrumental in getting it properly designed. And you have to remember, back in the early 60s, there were 3 ideas of going to the moon, and nobody really knew exactly what. Werner von Braun had the idea of making a huge rocket and landing it backwards on the moon, which would have been incredibly difficult and very dangerous. The other one was to construct a space station, either in Earth orbit or between the Earth and the moon, and assembling a lunar spacecraft there. But that would have been even incredibly difficult to do, even more. And it was a guy like Owen Maynard who said, well, why don't we do a orbital rendezvous where we have 2 small spacecraft, a command module and a lunar module, and we dock them in space. And at that time, everybody was afraid of docking. People, the engineers at NASA weren't sure, is this possible? Can we rendezvous? Can spacecraft reach another one in orbit? Are they going to be able to find it? And they proved, yeah, they can. But at that time, nobody was sure. And because it was so simple and a lot more inexpensive to do, they went with that idea. So Owen Maynard, a great Canadian, and then you got Jim Chamberlain, who had also worked on the Avro Arrow. And I won't go into detail with the Avro Arrow. It was Canada's interceptor aircraft during the Cold War. And the program got canceled right in the late 50s. And unfortunately, 15,000 of the world's best engineers were laid off. Maybe not 15,000 engineers, but the crew, the people who worked on the Avro Arrow was at least 15,000, but there were hundreds of fantastic engineers, and most of them went to the United States to work on the space program, whether through other corporate companies, aerospace companies, or directly with NASA. And when NASA started, I think they called it was it the Space Task Group? A third of their engineers were Canadian, and Jim Chamberlain and Owen Maynard were part of that. And Chamberlain is considered to be was considered at that time the smartest, one of the smartest engineers at NASA. And he basically came up with the idea of the Gemini program, because NASA had started with Mercury and then they went right ahead to Apollo, but they didn't really know how to do orbital rendezvous and long duration missions. And Chamberlain came up with the idea very quickly, because he didn't have a lot of time, of Gemini, the Gemini capsule, where you have two astronauts in there. It was done very quickly. It worked very well, and it allowed them to learn and study the astronauts while in weightlessness, because nobody knew how long can a person survive in weightlessness for more than a couple of days. So yeah, it was a very instrumental program, and he was one of the few that spearheaded the whole project for a time being. So if you want to read some fascinating detailed stuff, those are only two of the many that worked, the Canadians that worked at NASA. Another Canadian I want to talk about is George Klein, and he was quite an extraordinary inventor. He worked for National Research Council of Canada, which is an organization that does a lot of research, scientific research on all kinds of things. He also worked for Spar Aerospace, which was I think it was a branch of the National Research Council, I think, but it was more of a space, Canada's NASA, basically. And he had come up with the idea of a retractable antenna. And that was a big problem with NASA. They were making these spacecraft, but they needed antennas to retract and hide away during launch. And they had not been able to do a smaller, compact antenna that worked. And he had already developed one that was quite successful. It was used on Canada's first satellite, the Alouette, on the crash indicators that were used on a lot of aircraft. There was an antenna that would pop out to be able to find the crashed airplane. And they ended up using that in the Apollo, I believe, I don't know if it was the service module or the command module, but they used it in there on all of the Apollo missions. So there's a little bit of Canadiana right there, of a very vital component. And there are many other components and people had done stuff, but he's kind of Canada's great inventor. Another book I want to talk about, it's less about Canadian content, but just about the study that was done on women being astronauts during the Mercury program, when they selected John Glenn and Alan Shepard and all those guys. And the doctor that was doing all of the studies, all of the tests, because they didn't know, can astronauts really go into space? This was very early 60s. He secretly did one on women just to have another set of information. And he found that they were actually as good or better than men as astronauts, because they were smaller, lighter, they ate less, they consumed less oxygen and water. They could handle the loneliness of being in space, confined spaces better. And it's a shame that we didn't get any women astronauts till the early 80s when Sally Ride went up. The Russians, of course, had sent up Valentina Tereshkova back in 60, oh gosh, I can't remember now, is it 62? Early 60s. But I think it would have been, a great idea to send that. But it was a product, during those times. Sadly, women weren't allowed to do stuff like this. Sadly, but thank God times have changed. But this is an interesting story. It's a behind-the-scenes look on some of the pilots who had tested for this. So this is called "Promised to the Moon" by Stephanie Nolan. And by the way, the George Klein book is "The Great Inventor" by Richard Bourgeois Doyle. Richard Bourgeois Doyle. And "The Arrows to the Moon" is by Chris Gaynor. So if you want to read that, Chris Gaynor. And of course, we have Chris Hadfield, who talks about his life and his experience into space. Definitely a good read. Considered one of the top astronauts in the world. And if you want some bad astronomy, or if you want to correct your bad astronomy information, there's a fun book here called "Bad Astronomy" by Philip Plait. And it's a fun one. He corrects a lot of bad information on all kinds of subjects about space, our misconceptions about why do we have a blue sky, and why is it that we don't see stars on the moon, in the moon photos and that kind of thing. There's all kinds of explanations. So this is actually really good, a really good book. So that's I think that's it. So I'll be doing another one of these occasionally. So make sure you hit the bell, subscribe, and share. Bye.